It's good to see each one of you here. I'm a little jealous of Group 3. They had a low country boil last night, and I've thought about it all week. Eddie, we should think about something like that. Was it good? I love seafood. It is good. They did what they did. My understanding, everybody was there except for a couple, and that's great. That's what groups are supposed to be doing. And we've had a couple of get-togethers ourselves, but low country boil, man, that's pretty good stuff. We had steak, but the low country boil sounded better. We worked cattle and came home, and she had laid the steaks out, and they tasted good too. But anyway, we're studying Malachi. I did not. We talked last week, and of course we've talked about the introduction to Malachi, and we see a people addressed here by the prophet Malachi that are pretty much very sick spiritually. The period of time that Malachi addresses here is the little segment of time between the time the first group came back from Babylon, which later was Persia, Medo-Persia. The first group that came back with the intent to build the temple. And there was a span of time in there of a few years between the time they came back and Ezra came back. And they sputtered when they came back. The people that surrounded the Jerusalem, the countries that existed, went to the king and complained because they're going to build back and they're going to be our enemies. And they did everything they could politically to prevent, and I'm sure physically as well. But this group that went back were not very motivated to start with. The priests were corrupt. The people were not spiritual. And that's the situation that Malachi is dealing with. That's the period of time that he wrote. Nehemiah, remember, recorded the last physical book, or it was the last physical writing before the New Testament. Malachi is the last prophecy. And so this is the period of time that God addresses these people through Malachi. Last week, as we got into chapter 1 and talked about chapter 1, we looked at the fact that these people had lost their faith. They had been through a period of slavery. I don't know how much spiritual teaching was done during that period of time. Whose responsibility was it to be doing the spiritual teaching during the time they were enslaved? The priests, exactly. And they had laid down on the job. There are so many parallels between what went on here and what goes on today, and so many lessons to take from this book that it's going to take longer for me to cover this than it has the other prophets, because they were kind of singular, at least the ones we've talked about. They were kind of singular in their message, but Malachi is full of lessons and full of things that we can take from it. And here we have a group of people that had become despondent. They had been through this, and they expected to come back to Jerusalem and God just lay it all out before them, and they wouldn't have to do anything. It'd all be there. And that's not the way it was when they came back. Since Adam and Eve, God ever laid it out that way for people? The children of Israel in the Promised Land, they kind of had similar thoughts in mind when they came out of Egypt, did they not? And when they got into the wilderness, God started teaching them lessons. He started making them stronger, and they were so foul, and I don't mean bird foul, I mean they were rotten. They wouldn't defend themselves, they wouldn't do anything. And all of that generation died, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, before they went into the Promised Land. But he raised up a people that could go in and take the Promised Land. And they learned to do that by overcoming adversity and putting their faith in God. I was thinking about the song that Robbie led first, God Hear Me When I Call. We truly are helpless without God. We get pretty full of ourselves sometimes when things are going well and don't think as much about God as we need to, but God, we are totally dependent on Him. And we're here but for a short time. I was on the internet for a few minutes last night, and I saw a T-shirt that said, "I didn't realize growing old would go this fast." And that is certainly true. Our lives go by in a snap, just like that. Billy's in her 90s. I'm sure she could speak to that as well. All these things, memories of yesterday are just like they were yesterday. But boom, we're here. And we're not going to be here long, but we're going to be in eternity forever. And so how we conduct ourselves here and the priorities we set here and the thoughts we have here and the efforts we put into serving God here are going to make a major difference for eternity. We get all wrapped up in preparing for tomorrow, but boy, we need to be thinking long term as well. And Malachi will talk about this in his book. Actually, toward the end of this chapter, he makes reference to the church. And so we're going to see these things, but that's where these people were. Malachi says in chapter 1, verse 2, "I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast you loved us? Hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I love Jacob?" We talked about last week how God chose Jacob over Esau to bring Christ to mankind. And he gave the children of Israel their land. He gave them promise. Of course, Abraham's promise that he would bless all generations through his seed. They had every advantage. All they had to do was be obedient. And, of course, they failed to do that, which is why Malachi is writing to begin with. We talked about last week how God laid waste to Edom, which was the descendants of Esau. They had the attitude, well, we'll just build back. But God didn't allow them to build back. They were a thorn in Israel's side. So he certainly had blessed them. They just were not seeing it. And so we are... I made this comment last week too, and we talked about this when we studied Obadiah. The Edomites eventually lost their identity and were absorbed into the Nabateans, which is the Arabs. God points out to the Israelites that seeing the destruction of Edom and the coming of the church, let me start that again. God points to them seeing the destruction of Edom and the coming of the church and the enlarging of his kingdom with the Gentiles in Malachi 1:5. "And your eyes shall see, and you shall say, the Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel." There were a lot of things that they were going to see, the people that he was prophesying to. They were going to see Ezra come back. They were going to see the divorce of the heathen women that had brought so much problems to them to begin with. I don't think I'd given as much thought to this until I studied this, the fact that the Israelites who had married heathen women had divorced their own wives to do that. And God hates divorce, and that's a lesson we'll talk about as we get to it. But that's how corrupt these people had become. And so he makes reference to them eventually seeing the church in verse 5. In verses 6 through 9 of Malachi chapter 1, we see Israel's ingratitude even seen in their sacrifices. Verse 6, "A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name, and ye say, wherein have ye despised thy name? Ye offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that ye say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if ye offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And if ye offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? And now I pray you, beseech God that he will be gracious unto us. This hath been by your means. Will he regard your persons, saith the Lord of hosts? Here in the sacrifices, and of course the priests offered the sacrifices, they did it with the wrong attitude. They were going through the motions, and that wrong attitude corrupted the sacrifice. But the people who were given the sacrifice were literally given of their waste instead of their best. And, what was God's expectation for the Jews with regard to the giving of their sacrifices? It was supposed to be without blemish. I don't know if I've got this verse in here or not, but it actually is specified which one you gave based on when they came. But it was supposed to be perfect. The sacrifice for our sins, what was it? It was perfection in every way. And so they were supposed to give of their best. I'm reminded of a man when I was a little boy that came to church in Shady and would stand and rattle his change during prayer. Remember that, Travis? But I remember many times when I was little just see him when the plate come through, just reach and grab some change and throw it in the plate. That kind of is what they were doing. Their sacrifice was not one of thought and dedication. It was an afterthought. And so the attitude was not correct. The priests were wrong, but the people were wrong as well. And it points out that the priest's attitude was bad. It also points to the fact that they literally were giving the lame, the blind. If you have animals, you've always got some that aren't like they need to be. I've got a cow that's got a busted knee, and she's been in a lot by herself with her calf all summer. You've always got that if you have livestock. And so they literally were taking something that they were going to get rid of anyway and giving it to God. Is that honoring God? Not at all. And he starts out here, it says, the son honors his father and the servant his master. If then I be a father, where's mine honor? Their mind was not in this. They were just going through the motions. The priests had become so worldly that they showed contempt for God and the sacrifices. They didn't teach the law and respect it, and they didn't teach the law to the people. We can take a message here as well. If we stand before you and teach, and let's say that our attitude's right, but you aren't receiving it with the standpoint of I want to get better and I want to grow, then your attitude is wrong too. But I could stand up here and teach this, what I'm teaching, and pull this off with a bad attitude myself, and you still get it. There was a situation that the apostles came to Christ and said that these people are casting out devils. And he points out to them, if they're doing it, then they're doing it with the power of God. And that's not even close to an exact quote, but that was the situation. And it is important that the individuals that are being taught act as well. And of course, the apostles were given the limited commission, and they were able to lay hands on people. So it was possible that people were casting out devils that weren't the apostles. But in this situation here, neither the priests nor the people had the right attitude about it. And so everything they were doing was contemptible before God. Exodus 20 verse 12 talks about honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days be long upon the land which the Lord thy God hath given thee. How important is it to teach to honor father and mother if you are a parent? I mean, obviously it's important that we teach it within the family unit, but what does that do societally? You're all over what I was thinking here. So, right. If they don't honor their parents, they won't honor teachers, they won't honor governments, and they won't honor God because they don't understand honor. And so all this starts at home. Strong homes make strong communities, and strong communities make strong countries. It also affects our honor to God. Honor is something that has to be taught. Respect is something that has to be taught. And it's important that parents recognize their responsibility in teaching this. And discipline is part of that, of course, but teaching respect. I hear every day Kim coming home talking about kids that show no respect for anybody. And of course, schools' hands are tied. They can't touch. I read that thing last week in the class about the guy that wrote on death row that his mom ought to be there with him because she didn't teach him anything about respect and about doing what he ought to do. She supported him as wrong. Well, those are big responsibilities, but when you think about the responsibilities of teaching honor and respect at home, how far that reaches, it's huge. And the elder needs to teach the younger that this is what you need to do. This is how you need to conduct yourself. And then you'll have kids with respect. And all is not lost because the comments Eddie made are very true. What Kim tells me about every day is very true. But I work over at the Ag Center, and if something's going on, a lot of times I'll be in there and I will talk to groups that come in. I've talked to 2 groups of teenagers from Dobbins Bennett this summer about the value of agriculture to society and so on and so forth. And of course, these are city kids, things they have never seen or heard about. But what has really impressed me about this bunch of kids is they're very respectful. They show manners. It's been fun. It really has. They come through and say, thank you for opening the door. They hold their hand up, excuse me, when they want to ask a question. I thought, man, this is all right. And that's the impression that teaching honor and respect has on people if you teach it. So do it. Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21, the old law had laws regarding this as well. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that when they have chastened him, will he not hearken unto him, then shall his father and mother lay hold on him and bring him out unto the elders of his city and unto the gate of this place, and they shall say unto the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Obviously, this is an older kid. And all the men of his city shall stone him with stones that he die. So shalt thou put evil away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. God was building a strong society here, and this is stern discipline. If you had rebellion with a son, he was to be stoned. And I'm sure they carried this out early on. That eliminated problems in society. Now this is draconian, obviously, but it's there for our learning. This is not taught in the New Testament. This is not law now. But it shows the importance of parents teaching their kids right. Anyone who fails to be obedient shows contempt for God. God has expectations for us, and it's important that our heart be right. And we're going to quote John 4:24 a lot, but those that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And spirit means with the right attitude, and truth means we do what He says. If we don't do that, then we're showing contempt for God. I heard Mike Huckabee speak this week, and the Bristol Chamber of Commerce has an annual prayer breakfast, and they invite some big speaker in. And Ron Ramsey had bought a table and invited me to go, so I went. I wanted to hear him. But you see a big group of people that kind of are focused on the same things, and it's encouraging from that standpoint, but then you hear someone get up and pray, and they pray for Israel, and they do all this stuff about Israel, and you know where that is. You know where that's going, and it's because they're off the track. And you see that, and you think about these very things that we're talking about here, about worshiping in spirit and in truth. And it's a solemn and a serious thing. 1 Samuel 15:22, and Samuel said, "Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." Samuel's talking about the idea of going through the motions with worship here, just like they were doing here when Malachi's dealing with it. God wants your attitude right. He wants you in the worship. He wants you to be a participant, to be doing what you're supposed to do. And too many people today go through the motions. This is something that I have beat on myself as I've studied this and thought about where I am and where I ought to be spiritually. Hopefully, as you think about these things, you examine yourselves, but this has been stark for me. I'm trying a lot harder to pay attention to what's going on in songs when I sing. I'm trying a lot harder to listen when someone leads public prayer. That's something that's always been a struggle for me, because my mind chases rabbits like crazy. When Mike led the prayer this morning, and thank God for Travis being back with us, my mind went, and I had to jerk it back, because you do it. It's human nature. People think 500 times faster than they talk. You ever thought about that? You literally can sing every song this morning and not think about a single word, because a lot of the songs we've sung over and over, and I've been guilty of doing that. And so concentration and doing what God wants us to do in worship, we need to be present for it. We can be here all morning long and not have done a single thing acceptable if we're not careful. That's what they were doing here in Malachi, and that's a big lesson, and it's a big lesson for Mike Blevins, because Mike Blevins' mind wanders a lot. Yeah, Eddie. All about me. Yeah, and that's a good point. And knitting these things together, which that's part of it, is interesting, I think, because of what they did. And there's so many parallels to today. The point here, and the point, like I said, especially to me, is I've got to put a lot more effort into doing what I do when I get here. I've got to do a lot more effort during the week. I need to pray more. I need to think more. And we all can do that as well. Job 23:12. Of course, this is Job speaking. And Job's an amazing book if you study it. His friends are sitting there castigating him because of his dilemma. And they're blaming him for it. And Job says, "Neither have I gone back from the commandment of his lips. I have esteemed his words of his mouth more than my necessary food." Job's the oldest book in the Bible, supposedly. He lived under the patriarchal age, and there were priests, and what Job learned, he learned from the priests, so the priests had taught him here. But Job was a man of God, and he put God first. And one of the things you learn from studying Job is the importance of doing that. Job underwent a lot, but he stayed faithful in the end. 1 John 5:3 says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous." If we decide in our hearts that we are going to serve God and that there's nothing on this earth more important than doing that, then we're going to make good decisions and we're going to make right decisions. And it's not hard to do once you make that decision, What makes it hard is when you don't make that decision. There are things out there that I'd rather do. I'd rather drink. I'd rather go clubbing or something like that. If that is your mindset, then these commandments are going to be grievous. But we're only here for a short time, and how important is that stuff in the grand scheme of things? A lot more important to make that right decision and set that right priority. The priests had offered polluted sacrifices. They had a terrible attitude which polluted, as well as the offering itself. We read the passage a while ago from Samuel, it's better to obey than to sacrifice. They were going through the motions of this, and God's not going to accept it. Leviticus 21:6 says, "They shall be holy unto their God, and not profane the name of their God, for the offerings of the Lord made by fire, and the bread of their God they do offer. Therefore they shall be holy." God's saying here in Leviticus, and of course this is law, that they not profane their God with the offerings. They could do that with a bad attitude. If they weren't doing it for the right reasons, then they were profaning it, and God would not accept it. In Ezekiel 44:7, "And that ye have brought into my sanctuary strangers, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, to be in my sanctuary to pollute it, even my house, when ye offer my bread, the fat and the blood, and they have broken my covenant because of all your abominations." Once again, God's dealing with attitude here. We have studied Ezekiel on Wednesday nights, and we've studied Isaiah on Wednesday nights, and we have looked at where the children of Israel were before they were carried into captivity. What was going on in the temple? Offering sacrifices to pagan gods and all kinds of crazy stuff because they were behind closed doors. Could God not see all this? That's why they went to captivity. He taught them a lesson in captivity. It's a long drawn out lesson, and some of them never did get it. But they went into captivity because of this kind of stuff. Those priests were not holy themselves, and therefore the people were not holy because they weren't being led. When people make unauthorized changes to worship, they show contempt for God, and their worship is unacceptable. What's the general attitude among religious people today with regard to worship? Yeah, that's certainly a big chunk of it. What did you say, Tim? Whatever feels right. Exactly. People go, and whatever goes on, they're good with. And people are good with whatever religion you are. When you have the opportunity to talk to someone about these kinds of things, what's their attitude about it? It's all good. Yeah, Pete says it's all good all the time, but he's not talking about that. But I stole your statement. It's all good. That's people's attitude about religion. But what we learn by studying Malachi is it's not all okay. We are responsible for doing it God's way. If we don't do it God's way, He's not going to accept it, and we might as well be fishing. I saw a guy mowing coming over here this morning. He is a commercial mower, but there's been plenty of time lately to mow. But that's what he put first this morning. There are people all over Stoney Creek, Elizabethton, and the nation and the world doing things other than worshiping God today. And there are a whole lot of people saying they're worshiping that aren't doing it acceptably because they aren't doing it in an authorized way. John 4:23-24, I told you we were going to do this one a lot. "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship Him. God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth." With the right attitude and the way God commanded it. Did He tell us how to worship? With regard to music, what did He say do? Sing, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. Nowhere does He authorize instrumental music. But I want it, man. I love to hear guitar and drums. What does that matter? That's not what God asked for. We do what God asked for. It's a simple thing, but man's complicated it with his own wants and needs. With regard to singing, who's to sing? Everybody. So we can't have a special singer up here this morning. I heard one of those on the radio yesterday, I think. They were redoing a service somewhere. We can't have special singing because that's not authorized. Everyone's to sing. What happens when we sing? Huh? We make a melody in our heart. What else? We teach each other. And our songs go up as worship to God. So those are the things that take place. If we have a choir and we all sit and listen, who's doing the worshiping? They are. We're just sitting and listening. No matter if you can carry a tune or you're a good singer or a bad singer, you're supposed to sing. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. And if everybody has their heart in it, our singing is awesome. And it is. We sing good here. But we all need to have a part in it because it is a thing that we do together. With regard to prayer, we pray together. We don't have priests. We're all priests. All of these things are things that are part of true worship today. Tim? Amen. It's a good point, and it is a point that puts us where we are as a country today. Where we are politically as a country is scary, but it's that way because the kids that are coming up haven't been taught anything. Haven't been taught history, they haven't been taught to honor their father and mother, they haven't been taught respect. That's why people feel the burn. They don't know any better. Bernie, I mean.
He loved them, but they was going to do it.
Yeah.
And if it took fear to make them do it, it was fear that made them do it.
Well, understanding consequences is a little of both.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point, too. What'd you say, Betty?
I was talking to a member of the church a couple of weeks ago, and he got talking about music, singing. He said, I wouldn't have a bit of problem with the piano being in the building and even using it. I said, well, you need to go back and read your Bible a little more.
Right.
And he's been in the church.
Yeah.
But you don't have a problem with it.
John 4:24 condemns it because it's not authorized. And, I mean, that's sad. But Tim pointed out that if we're not careful, we'll slide into that. That's kind of where that guy is. Why not? Let's have a room full. We get a room full if we do what everybody wants us to do, but that's all we'll have is a room full. We won't be pleasing to God. Hebrews 10:29, of how much sore punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified, an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. You think about that passage in the context of what we're talking about here. If we worship God in an unauthorized way, we're showing contempt for the very sacrifice that Christ gave for us on the cross. We're doing it our way, and that will not be pleasing to God. And it's important that everybody understand that. 2 John 9, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. It's spelled out in the New Testament how we are to worship. If we do anything outside of that, then we're abiding not in the doctrine of Christ, and we're transgressing. Easy to understand, but people struggle with applying it. Galatians 1, 6 through 12. I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of the Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. If we make changes, we're perverting the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which ye have preached unto you, let him be accursed. Betty's acquaintance attitude fits this verse here. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach unto you any other gospel than you have received, let him be accursed. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if it yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. The point we're making here. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so for us to be acceptable, we need to adhere to the gospel. If we make changes, then we are putting ourselves in that accursed position. And it's a scary responsibility. It's something we all need to be careful about. It's something we all need to be on guard about. It's something that we personally need to apply ourselves to doing to the best of our ability, giving it all we've got. We're not going to be perfect. We're going to struggle at times, but we can always get up and go again and look forward to the future. Thank you, Chris. We'll start there next week.